Okay, so why don't we get started? People will join us as we go along. I know, so we have an hour and I know you're busy. So Patrick, I want to welcome you on behalf of our speaker series at Hopkins, and it's truly an honor. And I want to thank Bill Brody for introducing us last February. And just for people to know, is I invited Patrick last February and he was going to come visit us in May before the world started spinning backwards. And we spoke a few months back and he was kind enough to agree to join us tonight and share with us. And I thought it would just be incredible trying to keep us on step and keep moving forward in what's often a challenging time. So Patrick, welcome. So I thought-
honor's all mine. Thanks for having me.
So I thought I would tell everyone, it's interesting. Patrick is, happy birthday a week late. Patrick is 32 years old and from Ireland. And we have a lot of Hopkins people who are here from Ireland, and he's from a little place in Ireland. And I've read a lot about your growing up, that you taught yourself how to program computers. You took a gap year to learn how to do the English test rather than the Irish test to be able to go to MIT. At age 16, you're at MIT. Anne-Marie Lennon, who's from Ireland, who's from Dublin, who's head of GI here, told me, what did your mother say? Irish mothers usually don't let you be so free going.
Well, I think, well, actually, I was 17, I think, when I got to MIT, but, they were, I think she and they, both my parents, just found a really nice balance in being kind of, simultaneously kind of pushy, but also hands off. And I mean, that sounds kind of like a contradiction or something. But there was something about the way in which they kind of had and held high expectations, where at the same time, I guess, it was kind of high expectations, maybe in kind of unspecified direction. Coupled with a pretty significant amount of trust in that, I can't remember which of these stories I've told in the past, but like I remember our youngest brother had to go and have some surgery in the US back when John and I were pretty young. I don't remember exactly how young, but maybe we were 10 and 12 or something like that. Certainly within a year or so of that. They went to the US for, it was a fairly extensive surgery with a lengthy rehabilitation process. They were gone for, I don't know, maybe 4 weeks, 6 weeks, something like that. And they decided, well, we seem to be fairly decent at, doing our homework and taking care of ourselves and so on. And so they had one of our neighbors, actually a distant family relative, drive us to and pick us up from school to kind of, check in on us, or thereby check in on us over the course of the day. And other than that, we were kind of, by ourselves for a fairly extended period of time. And we thought it was awesome. We loved it. We did grand all the time. And we're sort of getting up to all sorts of, kind of constructive mischief in the sense that we were, working on things and building things and everything else. But hey, so I think they somehow found a nice balance there. And look, I never know. I mean, there's always such kind of, not survivorship bias, but sort of, it's always hard to judge the kind of decisions purely on the basis of the outcome. And, maybe we were just very lucky where that parenting style worked well, sort of with some accident of genetics and kind of how we happen to have been wired. And so, I don't know to what degree it generalizes, but for us, it was great.
So then you came over to the US and you went to MIT. And what were your goals? I mean, were you kind of one of those people who had this long-term vision of where you're going to be, or was it more, let me see what's going to happen here?
I loved reading. I loved reading stuff about science when I was a teenager, and about sort of technology and kind of the future in a broad sense. And I think probably like a lot of people on the call, I went to college thinking I'd be a scientist. I personally wanted to be a physicist because, when you read all the stuff like quantum mechanics and general relativity and all the rest, you can't help, I think, but sort of feel some of that same excitement. When I got to MIT, I realized fairly quickly that, well, actually two things. One, I just didn't think I was good enough to be sort of a top tier physicist. I met people who were just a lot better at physics than I was. And, maybe if I worked incredibly hard, I could sort of be, in the neighboring zip code of their coattails. But I really didn't feel like I could ever be as good. But then secondly, I was struck by the fact that, when you looked at sort of the frontier of physics then, I entered college in 2006. There's a line from Niels Bohr that the 20s, the 1910s and 20s were a time where even second-rate physicists could do first-year work. It was just like there was just so much great stuff going on. There was so much in the ether. We had kind of new promising approaches like relativity and quantum mechanics that were yielding a lot of fruit. And I felt like kind of 2006 was the opposite, where even the first-year physicists, people who were like incredibly brilliant, were sort of really having to pedal incredibly hard to sort of make any progress at all. And so I thought, well, maybe kind of physics is not the direction to choose. And then I guess I was also struck by everyone else around me seemed to have a very kind of definite conception of where they wanted to sort of go. It felt very, like in my head, all the stuff I'd read about MIT and college and all the rest, I'd grown up very far from it. It felt like this, the impression I got from afar was this very freewheeling place, like the MIT AI lab and all these hackers staying up all night and inventing all these crazy things and so on. When I got there, it felt much more like there was sort of a definite track, and okay, there were these mandatory courses you got to take, and it has to be sort of your course schedule has to be comprised in this pretty regimented fashion and so forth. And then I remember reading the campus newspaper a couple of weeks after I got there, maybe the second or third week, and reading that like half the class of the graduating year before me, so the class of '06. Had gone into finance. And so there was just, when I got there was kind of a fairly significant kind of mismatch between kind of the impression I'd gotten from afar and that which I then came to experience. And so I think that made me just interested in, well, how could I kind of shake it up a little bit? And, are there other paths available? I think that was a kind of, just not quite contrarian, but sort of some kind of response to what I found.
So you went and formed the company.
Yeah. It was, it's kind of funny to maybe say now, it both feels like so long ago and it's simultaneously so recent. But back in, 2006 in those old days, startups, obviously they had some level of kind of prestige and renown in the sense that, Google was public and, Amazon and Microsoft and Apple and all the rest, obviously they'd become already very significant businesses. But, I feel like we're still kind of in the cultural lull post '01. And certainly just among kind of my peers and friends and all the rest at college, people weren't really kind of thinking a whole lot about startups. It just wasn't kind of substantially kind of top of mind. But then some friends of mine sold Reddit, which was pretty young at that point. I think it was maybe a year old, to Condé Nast for the vast sum of $10 million. I think it was 10 million. It was, in that neighborhood, which, obviously in some sense is in fact a vast amount of money, but sort of, compared to all the crazy numbers one reads about today, today feels somewhat pedestrian. But I remember thinking, and I, again, kind of known them a bit, that they didn't seem, I met, when I met these like incredible physicists, I thought, well, they're incredible and I don't think I can ever do that. The founders of Reddit, to be clear, were also incredible people, but I just, for whatever reason, had sort of more of a sense that maybe I could do that. And I'd spend a lot of time programming and all this stuff. And so anyway, yeah, my brother and I, we decided to kind of start a little company, and that went okay. We ended up selling it for even less than Reddit, but it was a kind of success. And I think that sort of further emboldened us in this path.
So then you came back to school, and then you had another brilliant idea. Yeah,
look, I don't want to bore everyone here too much with the archaeology of my past, but maybe the thing to kind of extract from it is, between I think 16 and 20, early 20s, I kind of bounced around actually quite a bit, trying to figure out kind of what should I be doing, and some amount again of sort of distaste for not distaste, but sort of reluctance to snap to grid. And I thought, well, even though we'd started this little company and we'd sold it, I hadn't kind of really rejected the possibility that, maybe I should think a bit more seriously about pursuing an academic career. I'd dropped out the first time after just a semester and 1.2 semesters of school. So I barely dipped my toe in the water. And so felt a bit premature to like write off that whole world. So I went back, but then after another year, I was like, no, I think I can now feel some confidence in my conclusion.
So now eventually that was the company that becomes Stripe.
Right.
How did you, what made you think of Stripe? I've kind of read a lot about it, And 70% of the people in the audience are using it for transactions and probably don't know it. How did what made you think of something so simple and brilliant at the same time?
Um, you know, well, again, I'm trying to think about sort of what one could kind of generalize from it. I mean, the trite but true answer is it was a problem that in the course of building random websites and apps and things like that, just we ourselves had encountered. And it sounds a bit sort of hard to comprehend today, but there was just no service where you could go and over the course of an hour just get all the stuff you need set up to be accepting online payments, as embedded into your app or website. Now that we have that, it feels like just such an obvious and inevitable and necessary part of the ecosystem that I think it's hard to imagine a world without it. But sort of at the time, it didn't exist. Kind of versions of it existed, like PayPal was there, and that you could kind of use for that use case. There were merchant account providers, and they were like slow to set up. But if you did set it up, it could kind of work for this. So there was kind of bad versions of it basically. But there was nothing that for just an independent developer. And well, maybe backing up a little bit, 20 years previously, say in 19, say in the between 95 and let's say even 06, so let's say that 11-year period, it was actually pretty expensive to start a web service in many cases. You have to buy servers, you had to, the knowledge and the programming tools and all the rest, they were harder to get access to. The open source movement wasn't as vibrant, all this stuff. And so there wasn't really like a builder culture in the way that there is today. Like you could have held a hackathon maybe in 1998, but it would have been a much more kind of desultory affair. And the idea of just being able to like deploy it into production in the cloud and have a stampede of people come and use your service, that wasn't really possible. And so, when we were starting Stripe in I guess 2009, we were only kind of a couple of years into, I think, having the preconditions for a vibrant kind of builder economy or sort of developers experimenting with all these kind of interesting services. And so in that sense, I think it's more understandable why some of the, the other components hadn't really been built. So anyway, it was just a problem we'd run into ourselves. And, we spent actually a long time trying to find the existing solutions because we felt they must be out there, such an obvious thing. And it was only after sort of, a couple of months of, internalizing that they maybe weren't in fact there that we decided to go build it. And actually maybe, again, I'm always hesitant to sort of suggest that my own story, can be all that usefully applied elsewhere. The thing I have come to believe really strongly is, I think one of the most harmful mental models one can have in a sense is belief in the efficient market hypothesis. In that, I think if you're a stock trader in deeply liquid public markets, it's probably a helpful intuition to have. Although, of course, even there it can be wrong. But the idea that all the things that make sense to do, if they in fact knowably make sense, will already have been done, I think is actually just abjectly, completely, astoundingly untrue for all sorts of reasons. And it's maybe interesting to think about those reasons. But if one comes across some domain or some area and you're like, well, this just doesn't make sense and obviously somebody should X, I think it's actually completely possible that you're fully correct. While the world is, 7 billion people, in a sense, 7 billion is actually very few compared to sort of the total, surface area of all problems. And so actually the kind of density of people on problems is very sparse. And maybe just you're the first person to really think about this in the right way.
And so you were able to convince, I saw that your funding came from Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and Sequoia. So you were very much able to convince others of your idea being a good one.
Well, the funny thing is, on my second ever trip to the US when I was 16, I emailed this guy, Paul Graham. I cold emailed him, and he responded and he agreed to meet. And he was a prominent at the time Lisp programmer, which is also the programming language that I was using a lot. And we kind of met in that context. And, we just met at a cafe in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And, for reasons I kind of still don't fully understand, he really sort of took me seriously. And, I was a random 16-year-old kid and kind of used to going to school in my school uniform and doing my homework and all the rest. And he sort of A, treated me as an adult, and B, I don't know, just decided for, again, I don't kind of know why, but somehow some bit flipped, and he sort of seemed to think that I was capable of great things. And he introduced me to a whole bunch of other people at, other colleges. And I remember, like, the first time I ever went to Google was someone he put me in touch with there, and so on. And anyway, I bring this up because he's the person who introduced me to Peter Thiel, and also to Jeff Ralston, who was the investor who put us in touch with Elon Musk. And I don't know what would have happened if Paul hadn't replied to my email, or if, maybe he was just, if he had been having a bad day that day and I thought, this kid seems, kind of all right, but I'm too busy to, do anything else. And certainly both the specific things he did, but also just the depth of his conviction that, I should kind of make something of myself was, for a 16-year-old, that's a pretty powerful force, especially when it's one of your heroes. And I bring it up just because, well, again, it's very hard to know what the counterfactual was, but it sure felt like a quite pivotal intervention in my life. And it's just something I'm still very grateful for.
So I'm going to follow up on that and come back to one other thing. But one of the things you've also mentioned is, so Paul Graham would be a mentor of yours. You also talk about something called peer groups.
Yeah.
And so, in academics, everything is about mentoring. You got to have mentoring programs and this, that, and the other. A lot of it is just form fitting. But can you tell me what you think, explain what peer groups mean to you and what mentoring means to you, perhaps?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I kind of know enough about mentoring sort of yet. I mean, I've been very fortunate to be kind of on the receiving end of a certain amount of it, but I think maybe I won't sort of properly understand it until, I've had the opportunity to sort of, really kind of be on the other side of the equation. But for peer groups, well, I think, the great man theory of history is now, or I guess maybe more correctly, great person theory is now kind of has it smells musty. I think now we're sort of much more predisposed to emphasize circumstances and ideas that are kind of in the environment and so forth. And I think we probably somewhat underrate the idea of human agency and the fact that individual sort of specific identifiable people really can have influence. But I think actually the truth is somewhere like a little bit in between. And as far as I can tell from kind of digging into some of the specifics, it's not exactly the great man theory. It's not exactly the kind of full-on environmental version, but the kind of the great group theory or the great small group theory. And I think it's harder to see the influence of small groups because much of their interaction tends to be informal, and because they don't tend to have a name, the group doesn't have sort of a neat biographical sort of trajectory. And so, I think for a biographer or for a historian or, whatever, I think it's a little bit difficult to sort of to uncover and to sort of make legible and to, figure out all the edges of influence sort of between the nodes and the participants. But as I look at, some of the ecosystems and environments that I'm familiar with, be it the startup ecosystem or the Lisp ecosystem or the physics ecosystem or various economics ecosystems, the folks around Keynes and Oxford Cambridge economics back to the early part of the 20th century, or Austrian economics and whatever, all these kind of different versions. Up to and including, the modern AI scene and whatever, the right sort of level of abstraction, it seems to me, to kind of analyze these this production seems to me to be the small group. Now, if that's true, then I think it's kind of interesting to kind of dig a little bit into sort of why or kind of what's going on. And, I think to really develop good ideas, it seems to me that you're at least much more likely to, when you have the opportunity to sort of co-develop them with others. And there's certainly kind of an amplification of just like, sheer output possibility, right? And that, one person is one person, whereas a group actually does more. There's also, I think, something about who you're even trying to impress, in that, we're all kind of social creatures in the sense that, deep down, I think we're kind of performing for others in that, I think many things that motivate us are actually just kind of proxies for the esteem of others. And I think if you really get the right peer group that sort of in turn admires the right things, you can get this kind of incredibly virtuous cycle going. So anyway, we could kind of spend more time on that, but there's actually sort of an interesting book on the topic, Organizing Genius, that talks a bit about this phenomenon of the sort of the really productive small group and sort of goes through analyzing a number of them. I would love to read the kind of the historical series where, for various individuals, typically sort of analyzed as individuals, one tries to instead identify the small group around them and to tell that story.
Okay. And that's, it's sort of birds of a feather together. It's very successful. So you're starting Stripe. You're a programmer, developer, installer of the program on people's computers, I heard. So then the company gets bigger and bigger. And I was reading today, the company is about 2,800 employees. So now you're the CEO, but now you're managing a lot of people. You're hiring a lot of people. Mm-hmm. How do you go about hiring? And I've read some stuff you wrote that I thought was brilliant. How do you're hiring someone senior? Mm-hmm. How do you know? What are you looking at when you're hiring somebody?
I think it's, the different ways in which one can be effective, is so kind of variegated, and people are so multidimensional that I think reducing it to kind of characteristics is tough. I read once, and I have not been subsequently able to find this paper, and so maybe if anyone listening knows of it, maybe it's apocryphal, but I read once, if anyone knows of it, I'd appreciate the pointer. But I read once that, I'm sure you all have heard that sort of, in actual empirical studies, when you poll a group of people, there are sort of various ways to kind of aggregate the group's knowledge and to have that collective intelligence be greater than the intelligence of any single member. And furthermore, you can even do a bit better than averaging, which is kind of interesting. The best algorithm that I'm aware of that exists is you ask people, what do you think the most common answer will be? And then, what do you think the answer is? And that way, if people know that, for example, you're asking what's the capital of California, maybe the majority answer would be sort of Los Angeles or something. But then if you see a lot of people who say, well, I think the majority answer will be Los Angeles, but I know the answer is Sacramento, you can kind of ascribe more weight to people who can correctly predict the common answer. Anyway, point being, collective intelligence can be better than that of the individual. What I read, and I believe to be true, but I'm not certain, is that if you ask people to simulate others, giving them advice or sort of answering questions that they're asked, that we're actually pretty good at predicting what others would say to things. And if we are ourselves internally inside our own brains attempt to kind of aggregate over simulated people, we can do better than we would typically do when asked various questions. I bring all of this up to say that one of the things that I think about in interviews are versions of that, and that just, would I go to this person for advice, do I think sufficiently highly of this person's characteristics that in some other world or life or time I myself would consider working for this person, and I think the sort of the broad versions of these questions where you're kind of subconsciously synthesizing are actually somewhat more effective than the kind of narrowly rubric based, do I think this person displays, tremendous hunger for X or, whatever. So that I think would be the broad thing. I mean, there are certain specific traits that really matter. I mean, I think intelligence really is important. I think there's a kind of diminishing returns, but it's certainly important for quite a ways. And I think motivation, the nature of motivation, both the magnitude of it and sort of where exactly it kind of comes from, I really just try to kind of build a mental model for that. Like, for example, some people are motivated by, you know, trying to, I think some people are motivated by trying to kind of solve problems and create equanimity and sort of smooth over chaos and disruption. And some people are motivated by making progress. And both those people can be quite effective, but I think they kind of tend to produce quite different outputs, and knowing kind of which way somebody is, tends to be weighted can be pretty important.
And in asking that question, I mean, in terms of, so now, you know, when it's you and your brother, it's easy to be motivated. You're looking at each other, you're flesh and blood of the same parents. And now you're a couple thousand employees. How do you keep people motivated on the goal? I mean, you're a big company. You're no longer just based in San Francisco. You're in different cities. I saw today you're going to let people work from even smaller cities if they're really good. I read that this morning. So how do you maintain that culture, those values, that when you're 20 people, it's easier than when you're 2,800 people?
Yeah, well, I think my excessively simple framework, which is, you know, a slight extension of others, is people are motivated by purpose, autonomy, a sense of mastery, and just the team and the people around them. And maybe you could kind of fold it into purpose, but I think it's worth splitting it out. So in Stripe's context, I think the idea of bolstering and bolstering the global economy, accelerating technological progress, improving or increasing both the magnitude, but also improving the distribution of sort of global welfare. I mean, those are all just valuable things to pursue. And it's not that everyone in the world necessarily is motivated by them, but, you know, we don't need everyone in the world. We just need kind of all the people in the world who really care about, you know, those particular ends. Fortunately, I think Stripe is an agglomeration of people who really do value those goals. Autonomy and mastery are, I think those can be present to kind of varying degrees in almost any organization. And it's just trying to really make sure that, you construct the organization the right way, so that, people have enough flexibility to, do things as they see fit and to not feel stifled and so on, while being sufficiently coordinated, such that, all the magnetic filings, point in sort of roughly the same direction, that we interfere constructively rather than destructively. That's where I think a lot of the important art of organizational design sort of comes into play. And, it sounds unglamorous and maybe even kind of, actively pedestrian, but in a sense really matters. And then, mastery kind of speaks for itself. The best people want to feel that they're, applying their talents, that they're bettering them and so forth. And then to kind of be around other similarly aligned people. I think, as with a lot of things about organizations, I don't think knowing what's important is that difficult. I mean, you could read essentially everything I just said in, umpteen books and blog posts and all the rest. This is not particular wisdom that I'm kind of espousing. I think the puzzle is more why there aren't more organizations that are actually trying or that actually can. I think for various reasons, pressures and incentives and dynamics seep into most organizations that undermine, again, either their ability or their motivation to be good places to work. And you end up in the kind of unfortunate situation where, after a certain point, if you had a fabulous leader, I mean, if you take the best leader in all startups and put them in many other organizations in the world, I'm not sure how much ability they would actually have to affect the kind of transformation they might seek to pursue. I've been, it's a whole other kind of kettle of fish, but my partner is a scientist, and I think a lot about sort of various things in science. I think the people in science, for the most part, are fabulous. I don't think you could hope for much better. But there are all sorts of sort of unfortunate organizational dynamics that somehow sort of stymie the progress of the whole. And so anyway, I think maybe in sort of thinking about, and obviously Stripe is far from being perfect, as anyone who works there can tell you, but to whatever degree Stripe works well, I think it's actually less, how is the leadership enlightened, and more what are the characteristics of the organization that enable us to do the obvious things that other organizations might not be able to do to the same extent.
Now, I know you read a lot. So I read that you read 2 books a day when you were a kid. I read like a book till I was 10 or something, the Mickey Mantle story or something. But, and then I was reading that you also have books that you recommend. So I figured, let me look up, maybe I'll read a couple of books you recommend. Then I looked at, there was 107 books in 2020, anywhere from Seneca to Charles Munger to a book by your mother. Now I understand why you had to put the last one there, of course, but you know, the books you have are really interesting in terms of the spectrum. I mean, looking at Seneca, which is, I don't know, 3rd century BC or somewhere around there, looking at that versus looking at Charles Munger's wisdom. I mean, what do you find in books that really that inspires you?
Honestly, well, I exercise a lot, and you know, I'll run or cycle or something on most days, and I don't know that I really enjoy exercising. I mean, sometimes I do. Like there's definitely moments where like, man, this vista is, you know, phenomenal or something. But a lot of the time it's like, oh, I'm kind of tired, and you know, it's early and whatever, and it's dark and cold. And you know, 3 minutes into your run, you're sort of huffing and puffing, and the air is, you know, catching in your throat, and your muscles are sore. Anyway, we've all been there. But you know, I do it, and you know, a lot of us do it because you sort of you just feel dissatisfied with yourself, you know, if you don't. And so in a sense, you dislike it, but it's the lesser of two evils. And I mean, look, I kind of enjoy reading, but I think it's actually more that I feel sort of not nervous, but it just feels bad to not have some understanding of all these things. Like I feel like I'm being kind of reckless by, you know, being a citizen of the world, doing various things and not knowing anything about X or Y or Z. And so often when I'm, you know, reading about something, it's because I feel like I really should have at least some knowledge of this. I mean, a lot of human ingenuity and thought and care and depth and all the rest, you know, has gone into almost every domain. And, you know, it seems as a participant in the human project, it just seems important to kind of, I don't know, honor is being too kind of solemn about it, but just, you know, to appreciate that by investing some effort in having some familiarity with it. So but I'd say it's closer to me to running than, I mean, I do enjoy reading, but I probably read different stuff if I was reading just for fun.
Now, let me go back a second. You mentioned something. Many of the people online, I know who's online, are I guess we're in medicine, so we're in science. Now, I read 2 really good articles you wrote in Atlantic magazine in 2019, 2018, which really challenged the way science is. And I've heard you speak. I think Reid Hoffman was interviewing you, and you made the point that we have 100 times more scientists, 100 times more papers, 100 times more money. Where's the discovery? Right. So tell me what your feeling is about science. And
yeah, well, you kind of summarized the case where, you know, basically things burgeoned by 2 orders of magnitude post World War II. And yeah, I think the relevant question is, are we getting kind of commensurate returns? And, you know, I think there are maybe sort of 3 separate reasons as to why we should really care as to whether or not we in fact are. You know, one, well, just that's very kind of civilizationally important. And if we can kind of bump up the rate of science or progress in science by, you know, a factor of 2 or even a factor of 50%, or maybe loftily, you know, a factor of 10, I think that would be, you know, great for our sort of collective well-being. And, you know, of course, events of 2020 are making that very starkly apparent, not only obviously with COVID-19, but also, you know, say in my in Stripe's home state of California with the recent wildfires. And so anyway, we need progress in aggregate, and science will be a big part of that, and always has been. Secondly, if it's getting slower or worse or harder, presumably we shouldn't a priori assume that we have reached the kind of terminal stage of that process. And if there's a deterioration, it's probably still going, or at least presumably that should be our kind of base expectation. And so even if we feel that the equilibrium today is tolerable, the equilibrium in 20 years might not be. And I mean, maybe you can again draw sort of an analogy to the California wildfires where, I think the thing that is most concerning about them is not the state of affairs today, challenging and tragic as that can be, but rather the trajectory where it looks like there might be a whole lot worse still in the not too distant future. So that's the second reason. And the third reason is, some of humanity's most talented people go into science. You spend a lot of time with people who both are that and who might become that in the future. And I think if we're limiting, their potential or that which they can achieve, I mean, I think that's also a kind of individual human tragedy where every person who's born is completely unique in the history of the universe and will never be repeated. And so even a kind of a single meaningfully stymied individual is actually, I think, a real kind of tragedy. So that's why I think it matters. And I guess the overarching thing that was particularly striking that kind of spurred me to write this article is like, look, there's a lot of problems in the world, obviously. Fortunately, a lot of them garner a significant amount of attention. And so, global poverty is a big issue, but, lots is written about it. There are many organizations and entities that sort of in various ways are trying to do something about it. The thing that's puzzling to me about the dynamics of science is, despite the kind of central civilizational importance, I don't know a single organization that's kind of really taken with trying to figure out or characterize kind of how does it work today, how could it work better, which things should we amplify, which things are holding us back, and so forth. I sometimes point out to people that NIH is a pretty big deal, largest science funding body in the world, of course, by far the biggest science funding body in the US. As far as I can tell, there's not a single book just about the functioning of the NIH. It's one of the most important kind of institutions in a sense in the world. I mean, there's a lot of books about like how to get an NIH grant. There's a lot of memoirs of individual scientists and so on. That's all good and fine. But where are the critiques of the NIH? I don't mean critiques in a negative sense. I mean critiques in the like, okay, how can we make it even better? So I find that puzzling. I guess as I spend, more time in the question, and sorry, I'll pause here in just a second, but I guess I have become more concerned where the thing that's, become quite striking is science used to be a much more variegated thing. Like more different kinds of people became scientists. What doing science meant, there was more kind of more variation there. Who was funding it? There was more kind of dispersion. How one published, like the whole thing felt less monocultural. And in one of my favorite books, The Art of Doing Science and Engineering, Richard Hamming observes that when you optimize the components of a system without attention being paid to the functioning of the whole, it's very easy to make the total functioning worse. And it seems kind of paradoxical. You're optimizing the components. How could it be bad? And yet, because of the kind of complex emergent behavior of systems, it often can be. And so I do worry that as we have standardized science, in particular post-Second World War, we've standardized field boundaries, we've standardized journals, we've standardized funding mechanisms, we've standardized career paths, we've standardized the institutions themselves. I mean, there was a lot of turnover in the top institutions through the 19th century. There's been essentially no turnover in the 20th century, or obviously thus far in the 21st. And so I kind of came to all of this just thinking about sort of, science in the most kind of macroscopic sense. But as I've kind of, spent more time in it, talked to a lot of scientists, talked to people at various funding bodies and so forth, it's, in a sense, the picture has become more concerning because how we've gone about this whole thing has actually changed very meaningfully, in the last 70 years at kind of at the mechanism level. And, I think, again, one's prior should be that, some amount of kind of, suspicion sounds too pejorative, but certainly kind of reticence.
And do you think that the way we do things now really, it's kind of the opposite of venture capital. Venture capital will put money for really maybe risky ideas, but have great outcome, as
Yes.
opposed to you doing the same thing that 87 other people did before you. You think science is just, we're risk adverse, so people submit grants for 3 years that go 10% more than what they did before, because if they say they're going to do something incredible, it may not happen.
I think there's, I mean, yes, but I guess I would say in that, like, I do think that there is an interesting parallel between kind of startups and science, where kind of both domains are about producing these kind of crazy, like most things are duds and some things are crazy successes, you know, Lollapaloozas, as Munger would say. And so it's kind of how do you effectively farm in these domains where, you know, the really valuable returns are fairly sparsely distributed. But I am kind of cautious of overdrawing that analogy. You know, there really are, I think, also kind of meaningful differences. And so I certainly wouldn't suggest that, you know, we should just transplant the venture capital model from entrepreneurship to science. I think, you know, like the career path of science really does look different. And I think there was a kind of mastery in science that, I mean, sometimes in certain fields, you know, you can kind of really get to the frontier and be doing tremendous work, I think, with very little experience. Sometimes it does just require the gradual and painstaking accumulation of 20 years of knowledge in order to be able to kind of make the critical breakthrough. And, you know, I don't think that the venture capital model has any kind of particular answer for that. You know, the mechanics and dynamics of collaboration, you know, how would that work and so forth. Anyway, I wouldn't just try to transplant the model, but I do think that, you know, obviously the sort of prevailing situation today is we basically have, you know, the NIH and the NSF plus, you know, various foundations and nonprofits, but they're all considerably less influential because everyone basically determines their career paths on the basis of primarily the government kind of funding institutions. And, you know, a lot is then kind of downstream of that. And, you know, I think in startups, if the whole ecosystem was dominated by the National Entrepreneurship Foundation and the, you know, National Institutes of Startups, I suspect on that the ecosystem would be, you know, considerably less vibrant and dynamic. And so I do worry about a kind of crowding out effect given their dominance.
Now, you also mentioned about in your article that the science of progress, that why isn't there some organization that sets to figure out how do you maximize discovery? Why does it seem over history great things happen in select places?
Right.
May not last forever. I mean, Silicon Valley is, I've always said that's going to be remembered 1,000 years from now. And you mentioned in one of your articles about Eastern Europe and Germany in the
Sure.
1920s. You know, should we be doing something? You know, is there a way of mastering, putting, you know, making Manhattan Project or whatever you want to call it?
I mean, I would certainly like to think so. If I had to guess, I suspect so. And, you know, regardless, I think we should try. And, you know, there are, I think, tantalizing, you know, sort of glimmers of evidence that there is some amount of repeatability that's possible. And I'm very struck by, as you kind of, you know, really sort of assemble the web of relationships undergirding much of 20th century progress in the US, that, I mean, it really does suggest to you or remind you of this kind of idea of the kind of small group theory. And, you know, an example of progress that we all often cite is Norman Borlaug's, you know, invention of various sort of disease-resistant wheat and crop varieties. You know, he was funded by Warren Weaver at the Rockefeller Foundation. And if you look, well, how did Warren Weaver, you know, I mean, that was a kind of weird thing to fund. I mean, it makes sense in hindsight, but, you know, imagine being the grant officer who's like, we're just going to reinvent wheat. Like, it's really not sort of, it doesn't sound all that sane, you know, I think on the face of it, ab initio. And so where did he get his worldview? Well, he actually worked for Vannevar Bush at the NDRC during the Second World War, which, you know, of course, also, you know, initiated the Manhattan Project. And then if you think, well, okay, you know, what else worked really well? You know, people often cite PARC. Well, PARC was, of course, you know, substantially led or at least inspired by Alan Kay. If you talk to Alan Kay, you know, where did PARC get its kind of mindset and ideas and all the rest? From the ARPA community. Where did the ARPA community, which of course, you know, the internet, where did that get its kind of mindset and culture and ideas? They attribute it to the MIT Rad Lab, invented radar during the Second World War. Where did that come from? Well, the NDRC again, and Alfred Loomis and a bunch of the other kind of individuals in the penumbra of Bush. A year or two ago, I read a history of the Sidewinder missile. Just kind of randomly, it seemed like a kind of interesting thing. Developed at the China Lake Naval Research Base by, and you kind of trace back the lineage. Again, you go back to the NDRC. And look, my point is not that there's some mythic capability in specifically the NDRC. As you point out in your question, there are lots of other examples of completely disconnected wellsprings of progress. I think NDRC and its descendants is just a particularly striking American 20th century example. Maybe in time, Y Combinator will prove, who knows, to have attracted many of the same kinds of people and inculcated some of the same kind of mindset. I don't know. But anyway, in answer to your question, I hope the answer is yes.
Let me ask you a question. Bill Brody, who introduced us, had this question. So if people have questions, they can ask him, because I don't want to hog all the time.
Yeah, sorry, yes, please, question or
here's a question from Bill
or anything,
and I'll read it directly. You have upended the global payment processing industry that was locked in silos and local regulations, seemingly impenetrable by a startup entity. Right now, the healthcare industry in the US is buried under regulations and siloed legacy IT systems for billings, collections, data sharing, and patient records. Healthcare IT has been shown to actually reduce productivity of hospitals and caregivers. What would be your suggestion for how to approach transforming hospital IT?
Pretty sure I just do it in a different country. I think it's just impossible in the US, given the kind of calcification of the status quo for all sorts of an interlocking combination of regulatory, kind of trade body and institutional reasons. I think if I was trying to do it, and look, I know nothing about healthcare, but I would go to Vietnam or something and try to do it there and find the technology or the practices and the approaches that work. And then I think once you have a thing that works, you could try to sort of argue for its adoption back home, so to speak. But I guess I know of no path. Well, you would need to be able to iterate quickly, whatever you want to do. I think that would just be a precondition for success. I think we have banned quick iteration in healthcare in the US, and not for no good reasons. There can be very real costs for iteration, but for better or worse, and my personal view would be worse, it comes with that sort of significant second order, negative consequence. And my instinct would be you just can't do it here. And of course, many have tried, and by and large, most have failed.
What about Ireland? I was in Ireland. When I was in Ireland, I was speaking, and that's when they would change the healthcare, where they were, instead of having 50 hospitals do pancreatic surgery, they would have 4. And they would make sure they would only, so really were trying to improve the quality of health, because I think Ireland was high levels of spending, low levels compared to the EU countries. Right. They were trying to change it. Did that work?
Yeah. I'm not close enough to it, but I certainly don't think that, Ireland does not, meaningfully, I think, cracked any codes that the US should be kind of leaping to learn from, but the example that's often cited, but I think correctly so, is Singapore, which spends, about 4.9% of its GDP on healthcare as compared to about 19% in the US, with, across most dimensions, quite comparable outcomes. And so they're kind of in existence. And look, certain things are different. And so it's not necessarily kind of like for like, but, it's certainly thought-provoking as an existence proof that you can have a sort of real first world developed country kind of, top standard of care at less than, a third of the, in fact, almost a quarter of the aggregate cost. And, I think people are really correct to emphasize. And I think it's very easy to analyze that in terms of, sort of the material aspects and basically funding. And, there are very real questions there. But for whatever reason, there doesn't seem to be the kind of same vigor paid to, well, how could we cut the cost of provision in the US by a factor of 3? And, if we could do that, we could really make insurance a whole lot cheaper for a lot of people for whom it's currently quite prohibitive.
Do you think we need to really? It's not. It's as Bill was asking. Obviously, it's not an easy question. You think it's at this point it's almost impossible to change it here?
Yeah, impossible is a strong word, but I think it would be a very low expectation value. Yep. If I really wanted to innovate, I think I'd try to. I'm pretty sure I'd just try to do it elsewhere.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, I'm trying to figure out. Hopefully, it shows up on this question sheet. So I don't see anything. But let me ask you another thing that I found very interesting. You were writing.
But like I say, I hope there aren't a whole bunch of people here who are going to go innovate in healthcare, practice and in administration.
But let's see if I could. Let me
and
see.
if there are, feel free to object or interject. But
let me see. I see Dave Hellman here. Dave always has something great. So let me see if I hit him allowed to talk. Dave. Dave.
Yes, Elliot, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear you. Yes, can see you. We can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for being with us today. I've been really interested in what you've done, and Elliot, you've got another career in interviewing. I hope 60 Minutes isn't watching and doesn't try to poach you from Hopkins. I was interested in your thoughts about how hard it would be to reform information systems, medical information systems here in the U.S. And I can agree that would be very challenging. So I wanted to thank you for your comments, and you've mentioned a number of good books that I look forward to reading. So thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Let's see, Bill, Dr. Brody.
Yeah, well, it's impossible, but people solve impossible problems, just as you did, Patrick. Maybe the degree of difficulty is such that it'll take longer or take more shots on goal to get there, but something has to happen. I mean, it is so, as I can attest being a recent patient, just the communication from different providers and health system is just impossible. So
yeah, I mean, to use an example from, I hope whatever treatment you had went well and you're well, but use an example from a different domain. I've collected an assortment of various projects on my website that seem to have gone surprisingly quickly. And one of them is the TGV, the high-speed rail in France, which, if I'm remembering correctly, was built start to finish in 4.7 years. Maybe it was like very slightly longer, but not more than a year or two. But I'm pretty sure it was about 4.7. It was the second high-speed rail system in the world, and so there was a lot of innovation that had to happen as part of it. The first was the Shinkansen in Japan, and they had to contract with their domestic industries to figure out how are we even going to build electric locomotives? How are we going to build all the sort of apparatus around the railway line that facilitates high-speed rail? How will we build the viaducts and the tunnels and everything else that's required? And you need different grades and cambers and everything else. But start to finish in 4.7 years. And since then, since the early 70s when it was built. Presumably our technology has advanced a lot, right? We now have CAD, we have, we've built a lot of high-speed rail systems. And so, presumably we've learned some stuff from that, electric technology, batteries, everything, electronics have advanced a lot. And so you would think if you wanted to build a TGV in 2020, it would be a whole lot easier. But of course we have the kind of, tragicomic case of California high-speed rail. And the California High-Speed Rail Commission was formed in 1996. They currently project, I believe, that the first line will go live in 2033. I don't think anybody really expects us to hit that deadline, but it's the nominally projected date. And so even if we were to hit it, that'd be 37 years from project initiation to project completion. And so if we define technology as the ability to do more with less, then I think there are these sort of disconcerting areas in which our technology appears to be in fact regressing. Like, California's nominal GDP is substantially greater than France's GDP was back in the 70s, but we can't buy a high-speed rail line, with our dollars. It's almost literally kind of beyond our power. And I'm kind of exaggerating a little bit because of course we have the technology. We don't have as some kind of institutional or sort of civic capacity. But I think that diagnosis and that kind of etiology should really give us pause and raise concern. And I think it's kind of related, Bill, to some of what you observed, where obviously to build the ICT system that would work better, it's not actually that complicated. What's complicated are all the kind of socio-institutional dynamics around it. And I think a central question for kind of our society in 2020 is how we we were kind of we had first mover advantage for a long time. We had beginner's mind, as a society. Now we have a significant sort of legacy code base, so to speak. And how do we manage that maintenance and those transitions?
Okay, let me ask Anne Marie. So this is your compatriot from Dublin.
Wonderful.
Anne, are you there? Maybe I hit the wrong thing. Okay. Anne, you there? There she is.
Hi, thanks. I am indeed.
You got to speak in the phone. We can't hear you.
Yeah, I think your line is kind of stuttering or breaking up or something.
Okay, well, maybe.
I'm here. Thank you so
Okay.
much for being absolutely fascinating, and I've really enjoyed it. Okay. I think I may have a.
Think it's working?
Well, okay. Well, let's see.
We should ask in the chat.
Okay, let's see. Let me ask one other. Let me just get Ralph. Ralph, you there? Ralph.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, Ralph. We can hear you.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this hour. Thank you. You're such a thoughtful person. I really appreciate it. You alluded a little bit to artificial intelligence, and I'd love your thoughts on AI, not so much as kind of the smaller things, but the long term, the impact on society and mankind.
Yeah. I guess I'll say two things. Directly in response to that, I really don't know, and I'm very skeptical of anyone who sort of presumes to know with any degree of confidence. I think the distribution of possible future outcomes is really wide. I think that the kind of AI maximalists and those who would argue for the possibility of relatively near term, say in our lifetimes, artificial general intelligence, that can't be dismissed. And if we kind of unpack that and contemplate, well, would that be kind of good or bad, or in what circumstances might it be good or bad? I think there are kind of interesting embedded questions there as well, and I really don't suppose to know. I think there are maybe more interesting intermediate possibilities than sort of typically garner attention. It's very easy to kind of, as a kind of attractor in the space, get drawn to sort of to some kind of totalizing complete version of AI, but GPT-3 I think has actually been quite helpful in this regard of sort of raising or providing an example of AI that's powerful enough that one could readily imagine it being quite broadly applied, but obviously not so powerful that it's kind of a really meaningful replacement for kind of human cognition. And you all know a lot more about this than I do, but certainly I think that a lot of the arguments for the inevitability of AGI are specifically overstated because of overly or of kind of facile comparisons drawn to the human brain, where obviously we don't even really know how neurons work. We don't even really know the degree to which neurons are the whole story. And so, saying that, well, we'll have as many transistors as we will have neurons, or some kind of glib comparison like that, or even 10 to the 6 times more. I don't think personally, I don't find those arguments sort of especially persuasive. And you could just as easily say, well, you could assemble as many molecules as there are neurons in the human brain, but again, that's sort of live in the opposite direction. But anyway, I think all those analyses are just a lot more complicated. The second thing I'd say is, and I was discussing with Elliot at the end of this call, just what success would look like sort of for him, and he referenced that, well, we're kind of in month 6 of the pandemic, and maybe sort of at the outset, it's not that it was good, but it was at least different, and there was at least the possibility that some kind of either treatment or public health intervention or something might cause it to end sooner than we now understand it most likely will. And I think Elliot's right. I see it at Stripe as well. There's a kind of some amount of collective slump where just this is really not the trajectory that I think any of us wanted to be on. And so I don't presume to have any meaningful wisdom to offer, but I would argue quite strongly that while it might sound like some of what I'm making the case for is in a sense structurally pessimistic, that it's actually really the opposite, in that I think a common thread across a lot of the stuff that we've touched on here is that things actually could be a whole lot better. If we were in a situation where we were doing everything as effectively as we could and still all these problems seemed intractable, that would be bad news. We had the best people in the world focusing on curing some of our most challenging diseases. They don't feel inhibited. They feel optimally supported. They have the sort of the best possible conditions around them, and still they don't feel able to make much progress. But fortunately, we're not in that world. We're in a world where we have lots of kind of stupid problems and low-hanging fruit. And so, in a sense, I think it's kind of frustrating that the low-hanging fruit, exists. We wish those problems would be solved. But I also like the fact that that is the category of problem that surrounds us to such an extent. I think actually should cause us to upgrade our estimation of the amount of progress we could see in the relatively near term. I really think that we've kind of 1990 wasn't that different to today, and I think we've sort of subconsciously and culturally assumed that, well, maybe 30 years hence won't be that different again. I would really argue for rejecting that kind of thinking. The barriers and the limitations that in so many ways stymie us, I think, are to a very significant extent self-imposed. That is the good news and the bad news, but on net, I really think it's good news.
Okay, well, we've used up your hour, and I can go on for another couple of hours, but I know you have to run a $40 billion company. So, but I do have one last question. Did I pass the interview? And is Stripe looking for radiologists? That's my real question that I have.
Is Stripe looking for
radiologists?
Oh, I see. Got I am looking with interest at all these new ventures from Amazon to tons of startups that are trying to do various things in healthcare, but fortunately with Stripe, circumstances in the world around us teach us every day that the merits of sticking to our knitting. And so I think if and when anyone at Stripe needs radiology, we will know to look outside our walls.
Okay, I appreciate that. Well, Patrick, that was just terrific. I really do appreciate you taking the time to spend with us. I know you're super busy. It's really an honor, and everybody, on behalf of everybody, I do want to thank you for just sharing your thoughts, and we'll try to think different as well. Looking forward.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and hope we can get together in person someday.
Sounds great. Looking forward to it. Thanks, Patrick. Bye. Bye, everyone.